Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. Thank you as always for stopping by. I hope the week's gone well. Let me start by thanking Satish Kamath of Safaricom for the interview today regarding the Safaricom half-year results. I'll talk about that under a separate podcast focusing purely on Safaricom. It's a big beast at the Nairobi Securities Exchange and deserves its own podcast. Mark Carney has pulled the rug from underneath the pound, last trading at 130.52. UK interest rates rose for the first time in 10 years from 0.25% to 0.5%. The pound was more than 1% lower against the dollar. Take a look at this chart from Brexit. And then Holger gives us some other flavour of what happened to asset prices. BOE hikes by 25 basis points, vote 7-2 in a highly dovish manner, reversing the Brexit cut of 2016. Pound and 10-year gilt yields slumped. Bitcoin is the very definition of a bubble, Credit Suisse CEO says as cryptocurrency jumps above 7,000. Take a look at this record rally. This is a chart from Bloomberg, which gives you an idea of how it has turned exponential. Home thoughts. This is a tweet from the Reef Hotel. My grandfather owned the property next door, in point of fact. I just like the photograph there at the beach, the Reef Hotel in Mombasa. I also like this among my favorite Namibia photos taken not by me, close to the We Are Wilderness Huaned camp. David Yarrow looking forward to the Tusk Gala dinner in London tomorrow. Never seen more perfect tusks than this old girl's in the TSAVO, he said. John Henry Patterson, who famously slayed the man-eaters of TSAVO, said about the TSAVO, "The silence of an African jungle on a dark night needs to be experienced to be realized. It is most impressive, especially when one is absolutely alone and isolated from one's fellow creatures, as I was then." We took a lot of footage when we visited Finch Hattons. Take a look at this one. The untamed landscape in the TSAVO, volcanic rolling hills, Mazima Springs, and so much more. Daphne Sheldrick wrote a lovely piece about the impact on the TSAVO. This is from 1992. In TSAVO, man has not interfered with natural processes, but stood by and observed and learned from the long-term vegetational cycles and patterns that are nature's hallmark. During the tenureship of my late husband, who was warden of TSAVO East for almost 30 years, we accepted the constant fluctuation of different species triggered by these cycles as natural events, understanding that we still had a lot to learn, mindful of the fact that most life forms in that arid environment are dependent upon the activities of elephants. And she concluded by quoting the words of Sir Crispin Tickell, whose credentials would be as long as this lecture. As long as nature is seen as something outside ourselves, frontiered and foreign, separate, it is lost both to us and in us. It follows that to achieve a society in harmony with nature, we must be guided by respect for it. We should direct and integrate our lives consistently with it, rather than try to subjugate and control it. This requires deeper understanding and acceptance of natural processes, and an ability to cope with their inherent uncertainties. Thus, in the area of conservation, we should move from the static idea of conservation of places and things to the conservation of process, to allow natural processes to function and to create conditions in which they can do so. I like this photograph by Pinke Fader. And I attached one of my favorite quotes to it: "Nothing behind me, everything ahead of me, as is ever on the road." Political reflections: Rohingya people come from Myanmar to Bangladesh, then waiting in Palongkhali. It is a terrible and shocking story. Vladimir Putin opened the Wall of Sorrow Memorial to victims of political repression. In October 2015, I called him a geopolitical grandmaster, and indeed he's proven to be so. 2 US bombers carried out an exercise in the vicinity of the Korean Peninsula on November 2, Korean time, the US Air Force has said. Put up a photograph of US B-1B bombers flying from the coast of North Korea. Take you back to something I wrote in September this year: "The screaming comes across the sky," I said. Gravity's Rainbow is a 1973 novel by Thomas Pynchon, which is about the design, production and dispatch of V-2 rockets by the German military. In particular, it features the quest undertaken by several characters to uncover the secret of a mysterious device named the Schwarzgerät, the black device, slated to be installed in a rocket with the serial number 00000. As the world watches Pyongyang, I cannot help wondering if Kim Jong-un has read Pynchon, which speaks of a screaming comes across the sky. It is a curve each of them feels. It is the parabola. They must have guessed once or twice, guessed and refused to believe that everything always collectively had been moving toward that purified shape, latent in the sky, that shape of no surprise, no second chance, no return. I said Kim Jong-un has been precise and calibrated in his response to President Trump. Our final goal is to establish the equilibrium of real force with the US and make the US rulers dare not talk about a military option, he said. One of the strategies of the pre-regime change moment has been to demonize the other leader, and front and center in Kim's mind must be the image of Saddam Hussein being hung by his neck and Muammar Gaddafi meeting his death after having been sodomized with a bottle. When you view things from the Kim the Rocket Man's perspective, you might appreciate that far from being illogical, he is in fact being ruthlessly logical. And he's speaking the language his adversaries understand lucidly. 10 million folks in Seoul, just 60 kilometers from the border, 28,500 US soldiers are all in the line of fire. International markets, Bloomberg View says investors can party on. The central bank put isn't going away. This goes back to something I wrote in September last year: mirrors on the ceiling, the pink champagne on ice. Let's move on to the currency markets. Euro, dollar 116.43. Dollar index 94.80. Japanese yen 114.10. Swiss franc 0.9998. The pound 130.61. The Australian dollar, let me just give you that, that's at 0.7673. India rupee 64.605. South Korean won 1114.75. Brazilian real 326.80. Egyptian pound 17.6475. And South African rand 14.0546. The Bank of England's dovish rate hike pushes cable to fairly key level, where you have the 100-day moving average retracement and trendline convergence, as David Inglis. Last trading 130.65. Dollar index, I'll put up a 6-month chart, 94.782. We've moved beyond that key level of 93.50. That should be the stop, essentially. Euro dollar 116.44, putting some work in around these levels, but I think eventually we're going to drop to 114.50. Commodity markets, gold 12.75, it's run out of steam. Crude oil $54.95 after a steep sell-off. We've come right back. Let's keep an eye on that. Too wet for palm oil, too hot for soybeans, La Nina's twin threat. Emerging markets history shows emerging markets can't ignore politics much longer. Stocks, bonds, currencies, developing nations have soared over the past 21 months despite tremors on the global landscape from Brexit to Donald Trump's US presidency, not to mention coups and impeachments in their own backyards. Emerging assets are trading at or near record highs relative to a gauge of their political risk. According to Bloomberg, there's a similar trend for inflows into exchange-traded funds. I think it's very, very pricey now. Sub-Saharan Africa dollar bonds attract investors hungry for yield. The hunt for yield is taking investors such as M&G Investment to the world's least developed regions, Sub-Saharan Africa countries that 10 years ago didn't exist in the international bond market, are now reaching out to global investors. South Africa became the region's first dollar bond issuer in the 1990s, and in the past decade they've been joined by other sovereigns including Rwanda, Ghana, Cameroon. Most recently, Ivory Coast sold $1.25 billion of 16-year notes alongside a €625 million 8-year bond. African bond yields 12% on average according to AFMI Bloomberg African Bond Index, much higher than the Bloomberg Dollar Emerging Market Sovereign Bond Index at 4.4%. This is a photograph taken of Nikki Haley with President Kabila, but the DRC, as everyone is saying, is lurching into a crisis. The area is on the brink of a deadly disaster, warned the Norwegian Refugee Council on Wednesday. For years of clashes between militias representing the Luba ethnic group and Twa Pygmies in Tanganyika province have killed hundreds of people and forced thousands to flee into neighboring Zambia. The conflict, which has intensified in recent months, is part of a worsening humanitarian crisis in the DRC. Militia violence has spiked this year, fueled in part by President Kabila's refusal to step down when his constitutional mandate expired last December. Tanganyika is on the brink of a deadly disaster, said Ulrika Blom, NRC's Congo country director. It's a catastrophic cocktail about to blow up. Katumbi says the People Power movement will oust Kabila in December. He's warned Kabila against stretching the people's goodwill. Katumbi says President Kabila must cede power in December when his extended mandate expires or risk facing an uprising. In June 2016, I said President Kabila, however, outwitted Katumbi by removing him from the street in the Congo entirely. This might well prove a cleverly administered technical knockout, I said. And I was saying the opposition presidential hopeful Moise Katumbi had been leading the street against a third term for Kabila. Birthday boy Kabila is constitutionally barred from running for a third term, and Katumbi had set out his stall and was proving a formidable adversary. In fact, the numbers were building, and Katumbi must have been thinking this might just turn into a tsunami. President Kabila, however, outwitted Katumbi by removing him from the street in the Congo entirely. I said that might well prove a cleverly administered technical knockout. So he can't do any of this unless he gets back in the country. The Congo Central Bank has lowered the year-end inflation projection to, wait for it, 49.8%. South African all-share just off a record, up 17.13% year-to-date. Dollar rand back above 14, headed to 14.40 in my point of view. Egyptian pound 17.6475. Nigeria does not see devaluation risk in midterms, said the finance minister. Nigerian all-share is up 37.22% so far this year. Guide to the 19.5% bonds. Ghana can't get yield hunters to buy. Ghana's having a hard time selling $820 million of local currency debt. They aren't sovereign notes, which is part of the problem. Vast majority of offshore investors that can buy SEDI bonds have only got a mandate for sovereign risk, the government said in a statement. Over time, and as the structure performs, we expect more offshore buying. Ghana's Eurobonds are holding up just fine. They returned 18% this year. Nation is offering its energy bonds at about 200 basis points higher than the yield on local currency government debt due in 2026, and 50 basis points more than the average yield on a 10-year auction in April. Ghana Stock Exchange is up 39.93% this year. Bitcoin's price climbed to $12,400 in Zimbabwe. The Economist is talking of Zimbabwe's deepening crisis. John Robertson, an economist, reckons that the money supply expanded by 36% in the 12 months to August, 6 times more than the rate a few years earlier. What's behind that money? Nothing, says Rob Davies, another economist in Harare. It's a Ponzi scheme. Acacia Mining's chief executive and financial head have quit. Rio Tinto says Africa is the key to growth even after costly missteps, largest untapped source for growth for our industry. A lot of the minerals of the future will come from the continent. Our future with the East lies in Africa, and together we can participate in its transformation journey. Kenya's PMI hit a record low in October on political woes. The market Stanbic Kenya Purchasing Managers Index for manufacturing and services slumped to 34.4% from 40.9 in September, its lowest since the series began in January 2014. This caught my attention, this quote from Shailja Patel: "We need a democracy that delivers what Kenyans vote for, not a phallocracy that apportions power amongst ethno-patriarchs." Safaricom has reported first half earnings. I'll just detail them in brief here and do a separate podcast when I'll talk about them in more detail. Service revenue was up 12% at 109.73 billion. Voice revenue clocked to 3.6% increase. SMS revenue was up 3.4%. Mobile data up 31%. Usage per person up 66%. M-Pesa revenue up 16.2%, a little bit slower on that trajectory, but I think we saw a sharp slowdown in mobile money data during the electoral period. EBITDA up 6.8%, EBIT up 8.9%, profit before tax up 9.6%, basic and diluted EPS up 9% to 65 cents a share. My conclusions are that against a soft macro backdrop, Safaricom have served up another compelling set of earnings. Voice still alive and kicking, data plus 31%, M-Pesa plus 16.2% lead the charge. They are looking at geographical expansion. M-Soko takes them into e-commerce. These are strong and shapely earnings in my view. There's a link for a slide, a couple of slides from these earnings results. And then a bunch of tweets where I took some images, the first half results, another image of the results, excluding the one-off adjustment in the prior year, underlying EBIT grew by 20.6%. It was a strong financial performance driven by 12% growth in service revenue. And Satish said Kenya has an exponential potential for e-commerce. The chairman spoke about how they're looking to explore regional opportunities. We're looking at the external markets. That was an important statement. I took this photograph of Satish in the hot seat, and this photograph of Michael Joseph with the chairman of Safaricom. Nairobi all shares up 22.6% year to date, and the Nairobi NSE 20 is up 18.54% year to date. I wish you a tremendous weekend.